The night I found the second phone, I was looking for a pen. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 38 years old, a history teacher at Harlow Creek High School, and for 9 years I believed I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one, I wasn't naive enough to think that, but a solid one. The kind built on quiet routines and genuine affection and the particular comfort of knowing someone so well that you can predict their coffee order and their mood from the way they close the front door. I believed that. I kept on believing it long after I should have stopped. It was a Tuesday in late October. Claire had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. I was in the kitchen grading papers, and I needed a red pen. I checked the junk drawer, the one we'd had since we moved into this house, the one that accumulates everything: dead batteries, takeout menus, rubber bands, the small archaeology of a shared life. I found 3 dried-out markers, a birthday card I'd never mailed, a tape measure, and underneath a folded grocery receipt, a phone. Not our phone. Not one I'd ever seen. It was a cheap prepaid model, small and black, and it was powered off. I held it in my hand for a long moment. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Upstairs, I could hear Eli shifting in his sleep through the baby monitor we still kept on the counter even though he was 7, a habit neither of us had gotten around to breaking. I remember the exact quality of the silence in that moment. Not peaceful. Not ordinary. The kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that arrives right before something changes. I set the phone on the counter. I looked at it. I picked up my red pen, which had been sitting right next to it all along, as if it had been waiting for me, and I went back to my papers. I graded 4 more essays. I made comments in the margins about primary sources and chronological reasoning. I did not go back to the kitchen for 2 hours. Even then, I already knew. I just wasn't ready to know that I knew. That's the thing about being the kind of man I was, the patient kind, the understanding kind, the kind who always found an explanation because explanations were safer than conclusions. I had spent 9 years perfecting the art of looking at something directly and choosing to see something else. It wasn't stupidity. It was a skill I'd developed so gradually, so naturally, that I'd stopped noticing I was doing it. When I finally went back to the kitchen, the phone was gone. Let me tell you about Claire, because you can't understand any of this without understanding her. She was the kind of woman who filled a room, not loudly, not with performance, but with a quality of presence that made people turn toward her the way plants turn toward a window. She was warm and restless and intensely alive, and when we met at 26 and 29, I thought I was the luckiest man in Harlow Creek. Maybe in Ohio. She laughed at things that weren't quite jokes yet, half a beat before the punchline landed, as if she could hear the humor arriving. She cried at nature documentaries. She kept every card anyone ever gave her in a shoebox under the bed. We married after 2 years of dating. We bought the house on Sycamore Street 3 years after that. Eli arrived in the middle of a February snowstorm, and I held him in the delivery room and felt something shift permanently in my chest, a rearrangement of priorities so complete it was almost physical. For most of those 9 years, we were happy. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy now to rewrite the whole marriage as something dark and hollow, and it wasn't. There were years that were genuinely good. Years when we cooked dinner together on Sunday nights and went to Eli's soccer games and argued about nothing and made up easily and lay in the dark talking about things we wanted to do someday. The trouble is, when I look back now, I can trace the early signals all the way to the beginning. I just didn't know what I was reading. Marcus Hale came up for the first time about 6 months after our wedding. Claire mentioned him casually, the way you mention a piece of furniture. Oh, Marcus and I used to go to that bar in Columbus, over dinner one night. He was a college friend. They'd stayed in touch. She showed me a photo on her phone, a tall man with an easy smile, dark hair, standing at some rooftop party. I nodded. I said he seemed fun. I thought nothing of it. He existed at the edges of our life for years, a name that appeared occasionally, attached to a memory or a story. Marcus got a job in Chicago. Marcus is going through a rough patch, his girlfriend left him. Marcus might come visit sometime. I registered him the way you register a neighbor you've never properly met, a peripheral presence, occasionally mentioned, never threatening. I understand now that was by design. The first sign I truly noticed and then carefully, deliberately set aside, came in the spring of our 4th year of marriage. Claire had been to a work conference in Columbus for 3 days. When she came home, something was different. I couldn't name it then. I tried later, lying awake, and the closest I got was this: she came home too settled. After 3 days away she should have been tired, slightly disoriented, glad to be back. Instead she was relaxed in a way she almost never was at home, a deep, bone-level ease that she usually only had after a week of vacation. She hugged Eli and then me, and her hug felt like someone who had recently been very happy. I noticed it. I held it in my mind for a few days. And then I put it down, because what was I going to do with it? She'd been at a conference. People are happy after conferences. Looking back, that was the first time I chose the explanation over the evidence. Not because I was foolish. Because I was afraid, and afraid people are very, very good at choosing comfortable fictions. The pattern was minor at first. A text she'd angle her phone away from. A call she'd take in the backyard, standing near the fence, too far for me to hear. A Thursday night every few weeks when she stayed late at her office. She worked as a marketing manager for a mid-size healthcare company downtown, and came home smelling like she'd freshened up in a public bathroom, the particular combination of hand soap and cold air and something masked. Each thing, individually, was nothing. Together they formed a shape I wouldn't let myself see. The closest I came was one morning in September of our 6th year. Eli was at school. I was making coffee. Claire was upstairs getting ready for work, and her laptop was open on the kitchen table. It wasn't snooping, I wasn't even looking at it. But as I walked past I caught a name in an open email window. Marcus. Not the whole message. Just the name, and beneath it 2 words before the screen went dark from inactivity: last night. I stopped. The coffee maker finished its cycle and beeped. I stood there. Then I walked upstairs and told Claire her coffee was ready, and I went to work, and I taught 3 periods of World War II and 1 of the Cold War, and I told myself I hadn't seen anything worth examining because the alternative, the thing the alternative would require me to do, was not something I was ready for. This is the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. They ask, "Didn't you know?" And the answer is yes, somewhere. In the part of myself I'd trained to stay quiet. But knowledge and acknowledgement are not the same thing, and for years I managed to keep them separate with a kind of discipline that I now recognize was not strength. It was a very sophisticated, very exhausting form of self-betrayal. I loved Claire. I loved our life. I loved Eli's drawings on the refrigerator and the way Sunday mornings felt in our kitchen and the specific sound of Claire's laugh at something genuinely funny, a sound she made less often as the years went on, but still made. And I think somewhere I had decided, without ever stating it clearly, that losing those things was worse than whatever I might be not looking at. That endurance was a form of loyalty. That keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family. It wasn't. But it took me a long time to understand that. Paul, my colleague and closest friend, noticed something before I did. We were having a beer on his porch one evening in October. Eli was at Claire's parents' for the weekend, and he asked, not unkindly, "How are things at home?" "Really?" I told him fine. Things were fine. Claire was a little stressed with work. We'd had some friction lately, normal marriage stuff. I was good. We were good. Paul looked at me for a moment in the way he had. He was a perceptive man, taught English, read people the way he read novels, with attention to what wasn't being said, and then he nodded slowly and changed the subject. But before he did, he said something I didn't understand until much later. Just don't wait until you have no choice, Dan. You're better than that. I laughed it off. Finished my beer. Drove home. Eli was asleep when I got there. Claire was watching something on her laptop in bed, earphones in. She took one out when I came in, smiled at me, said, "How was Paul?" I told her. She put the earphone back in. I lay down beside her and stared at the ceiling in the dark, and something I couldn't name sat on my chest like a stone until I fell asleep. Marcus Hale visited in November. Claire mentioned it a week in advance, casual and matter-of-fact. Her old college friend was passing through Ohio, could he stay a couple of nights? I said of course. I meant it. I was still, at this point, genuinely able to believe in the innocent version of things, or at least to perform that belief convincingly enough to fool myself. He arrived on a Friday evening with a bottle of wine and the easy confidence of someone who has never had to try very hard at being liked. He was good-looking in an unremarkable way, the kind of face that photographs well but doesn't stay with you. He shook my hand warmly, crouched down to Eli's level and asked him about his favorite dinosaur with what seemed like genuine interest, and over dinner he was funny and self-deprecating and said all the right things. I watched Claire watch him. It wasn't dramatic. There were no lingering looks, no charged silences, no cinematic moment of exposure. What I noticed was subtler and more damning. She was at ease. The particular ease I'd seen that time she came back from Columbus. The restlessness that had become her baseline, a quality of distraction that had settled into her over years, a faint elsewhereness that I'd grown used to the way you grow used to a sound in the walls, it was gone. She laughed easily. She finished her sentences. She touched my arm twice at the table, more in those 2 hours than she had in the previous month. She was performing contentment. For his benefit, not mine. She needed him to see a happy marriage, and she was showing him one, and the performance was good enough that a part of me was almost grateful for it. That was the night I stopped being able to fully convince myself. Not because I had proof, I still had nothing concrete, but because something shifted in the way I was watching. I wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. I was looking for evidence. The change was small and internal and catastrophic. He stayed 3 nights. On Saturday, Claire offered to drive him to see some local historical sites. She knew I'd taught local history and framed it as, "Marcus is really interested, you'd know more than me, but I thought I could show him around." I was home with Eli. They were gone for 4 hours. When they came back, Claire was bright-eyed and talking quickly, the particular animation of someone filling silence on purpose. I made dinner. I was pleasant. I helped Eli with his bath and his bedtime story. I came back downstairs and the 3 of us watched a film, Claire on the couch between Marcus and me, and I sat there in my own living room feeling like a guest. He left Sunday morning. Hugs at the door, promises to visit again, a firm handshake for me and a ruffling of Eli's hair. Claire stood in the doorway and watched his car until it turned the corner. That evening, after Eli was in bed, I found Claire in the kitchen doing dishes. I stood in the doorway. "You seem fond of him," I said. She turned and looked at me. Something passed across her face, too quick to read. "We've been friends for a long time," she said. "It's just nice to see him." I nodded. "He seems like a good guy." "He is." I went to bed. I lay there and thought about the fact that for 3 days my wife had been more present, more alive, more fully herself than she'd been in months, and all of it had been for someone else. The phone in the junk drawer happened 3 weeks later. By then I had started paying attention in a different way, not obsessively, not with the sick energy of someone compiling a case, but with a quiet, focused attention that I'd spent years suppressing and had finally stopped suppressing. Small things. She had started charging her personal phone in the kitchen overnight instead of on her nightstand, a change she explained as, "I'm sleeping better without it next to me." She had begun taking longer lunch breaks. Twice in 1 week she mentioned Marcus in conversation, once to reference something funny he'd said at dinner, once to pass along that he'd recommended a podcast, and both times she said his name with a neutrality so deliberate it had texture. Then the junk drawer. Then the phone, gone by morning. I didn't confront her. Not then. I want to examine that choice honestly, because I've examined it many times since. I could tell myself I was waiting for more evidence, and that was partly true. But the fuller truth is that I was still, even then, hoping for a version of events that wouldn't require me to blow up the life I'd built. I had a son who loved both his parents. I had a house on Sycamore Street and a job I cared about and a marriage of 9 years. Confrontation meant all of that went into the air, and I didn't know where it would land. I called it patience. I understand now it was fear with a more dignified name. I did one thing. I told Paul. Not everything. I told him I'd found something I didn't understand and that I thought something was wrong and that I didn't know what to do. Paul listened. He didn't push for details. He said, "What does your gut tell you?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then you already know what you have to do. You're just not ready to do it yet. He was right. I wasn't ready. I gave myself more time, which is to say I gave her more time, which is to say that I picked up the weight of what I knew and kept carrying it, the way I'd been carrying it for years, because setting it down felt like an ending I wasn't prepared to survive. What I didn't know yet, what I was still weeks from understanding, was that the story was older than I thought. Much older. That Marcus Hale hadn't entered our marriage from outside. He had been there from the beginning. Before the beginning. I'm not a man who does things dramatically. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't install software on her phone. What I did was slower and quieter and, in its own way, more devastating. I started simply paying attention to what had always been in front of me. The first piece came from Claire's sister, Sandra. Sandra and I had always gotten along. She was warmer than Claire in some ways, less guarded, the kind of person who said what she meant with minimal buffering. She'd been at our wedding. She was Eli's favorite aunt. We had an easy relationship that had never required much maintenance. She called me in early December, on a Thursday evening when Claire was at her Thursday late at the office. She said she was calling to check in. We talked for 20 minutes about Eli, about the holidays, about her new apartment in Cincinnati. And then, near the end of the call, she said something that wasn't quite a question. "Have you and Claire been doing okay lately? She seems. I don't know. Distracted." "We're fine," I said. Automatic. The word came out before I'd chosen it. Sandra paused. Okay. Another pause. She mentioned Marcus a while back. Just his name in conversation, and something about it. She stopped herself. "Sandra," I said. "What do you know?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that I understood it completely. She hadn't called to check in. She'd called because she'd been carrying something and it had gotten too heavy. "They were together," she said finally. "Before you." "For about 2 years. I thought she'd told you." She hadn't told me. Claire had told me Marcus was a college friend. She had never once, in 9 years, mentioned that he had been her boyfriend. Her first serious one, as Sandra understood it. That they had been intensely involved, the kind of thing where she called me crying every other week, through most of their junior and senior year, and that it had ended badly, not because either of them wanted it to but because he'd taken a job in another city and neither of them could make it work across distance. "I assumed you knew," Sandra said. She sounded genuinely distressed. "I swear, Daniel. I thought it was old history." I thanked her. I got off the phone. I sat in the kitchen for a very long time. A man who was a college friend. That was the category I'd been given. And I had accepted it, filed it, closed the drawer. He was a college friend who came up occasionally, who visited for 3 days, who made my wife more herself than I'd managed to in months. I had registered all of this and found a way to make it benign, because benign was what I needed it to be. There's something almost impressive about the architecture of self-deception. It doesn't happen all at once. It's built slowly, one small accommodation at a time, until you've constructed something quite elaborate, a structure you live in comfortably without ever examining the foundation. I spent the following 2 weeks being careful. I behaved normally. I was present with Eli, attentive with Claire, unremarkable at work. I cooked dinner twice. I helped with Christmas decorations. I went through the motions with the particular numb precision of someone who understands that the motions are all that's holding things in place. What I was doing, underneath all of it, was watching. Claire's second phone revealed itself again 9 days after Sandra's call. Not in the junk drawer this time, she'd grown more careful, but in the pocket of her winter coat, which she'd left on the hook by the door. I found it when I was looking for her car keys to move her car off the street before the snow plows came. It was a different model than the first one I'd seen. Newer. This time I turned it on. It required a pin I didn't have, and I wasn't going to try to guess. But I didn't need to. The screen that lit up before the pin prompt was enough, 3 notifications from the same contact, previewed in the banner. The contact name was simply M. I could read the first line of each message. The first said, "Can't stop thinking about." The second, "When can I?" The third, "I know it's complicated but." I powered the phone off. I put it back in her coat pocket exactly as I'd found it. I moved her car. I came back inside and checked on Eli, who was building something elaborate with Legos on the living room floor, and I sat down beside him and helped him with the structural problem he was having with a roof section, and I did not cry, which surprised me. The clarity of that moment was unlike anything I'd felt in years. Not relief, nothing like relief. But the particular stillness that arrives when you stop fighting a tide and simply let it take you where it's going. I understood, sitting there on the floor with my son's Lego instructions spread between us, that this wasn't new. It was 9 years old, at minimum. That the story I'd been living had a version I hadn't been shown, and that version had been running parallel to mine for the entire length of my marriage. The conference in Columbus in year 4. The Thursdays. The second phone. The way she'd watched his car turn the corner. And before any of it, a relationship she'd never mentioned. An intimacy she'd imported into our marriage without declaration, maintaining it at whatever temperature she needed it to be, in whatever form the distance and the situation allowed. I had been, for 9 years, the stable backdrop to someone else's unfinished story. And I had held that position willingly, not because I didn't see the edges of it, but because I'd convinced myself that stability was the same as happiness, and that keeping the peace was the same as having one. I called Paul the next morning from my car in the school parking lot. I told him everything. Sandra, the phone, the messages, the history I hadn't known. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to her," I said. "But I need to know one more thing first." "What's that?" "How long?" I drove to Claire's office building that Thursday on my lunch break. I parked across the street in the lot of a dry cleaning place and I waited. I felt absurd, and I felt necessary, and after 45 minutes Claire came out of the building's side entrance with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder. She walked to her car. She drove north on Main Street. I followed at a distance, not skilled at this, not practiced, terrified of being seen and unable to stop. She drove 12 minutes to a hotel on the edge of town, a mid-range chain place with a parking lot that was half full on a Thursday afternoon. She pulled in. I parked on the street. I watched her walk to room 114. I sat there for 22 minutes. I know exactly how long because I watched the minutes change on my dashboard clock with the focused attention of someone who has nothing left to do but witness. Then I drove back to school and taught 2 afternoon periods of American history, and I was, by all accounts, completely normal. I chose Saturday evening. Eli was at Claire's parents' for the weekend, a pre-arranged sleepover that I had, in a different version of myself, suggested 2 weeks earlier. I understand now that I'd been preparing, in some quiet part of myself, longer than I'd consciously admitted. I cooked dinner. Nothing elaborate: pasta, a salad, the bottle of wine we'd been saving for something. I set the table properly, with candles, because I wanted the conversation to happen in a setting that reflected how seriously I was taking it. That probably sounds strange. It made sense to me. Claire came downstairs, saw the table, and smiled. "What's the occasion?" "Sit down," I said. "I want to talk to you." Something changed in her face. Not guilt, exactly, something more like the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a conversation to arrive and now feels it arriving. We sat. I poured the wine. I didn't touch mine. "I know about Marcus," I said. The silence was complete. "I know he wasn't just a college friend. Sandra told me you were together for 2 years. I know you've been in contact with him throughout our marriage. I know about the second phone. I know about the hotel on Thursdays." Claire set down her glass. Her hands were very still. "How long?" I asked. She looked at the table. Then at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying yet. "Before we met," she said. "We were together before I met you." "And after?" A pause. It wasn't continuous. "Claire. It started again about 4 years in." She said it quietly. Factual. As if accuracy might substitute for something. "It wasn't, I didn't plan it. When he was in Columbus for that conference." "Year 4, I said. She looked at me. "You knew?" I noticed something. I didn't let myself know. That landed. I watched it land. Something moved through her expression: surprise, then something more complicated, than what I can only describe as a recognition. "Daniel. I need to understand something," I said. "Not everything. Just one thing. Did you ever intend to stop?" The question sat between us for a long moment. The candles were lit. The pasta was getting cold. This was the dinner table I'd eaten at for 9 years, where Eli did his homework and where we'd had birthday celebrations and where we'd argued about nothing and made each other laugh. "I wanted to," she said. "I ended it twice." "It never." "That's not what I asked." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "No," she said. "I don't know if I would have. I'm sorry. I don't know." I had been prepared for anger. I'd expected it, had felt flashes of it for weeks. But in that moment what I felt instead was something much quieter, a settling, like a building finished its slow collapse and the dust was clearing and you could finally see the shape of what was left. "I covered for you," I said. "You know that? I moved your car in November. When I found the phone in your coat. I moved your car and put the phone back and I didn't say anything." She was crying now. Quietly. "I know. I told myself I was being patient. Giving us space. Not reacting before I was sure." I paused. But I wasn't waiting for more information. I already had enough. I was waiting for you to choose differently. On your own. Daniel. I thought that was what love looked like. Giving someone room. Not pushing. Not forcing a confrontation until there was absolutely no other option. I heard my own voice, steady, which surprised me. "I think I was wrong about that." She leaned forward. "It's not what you think with Marcus." "It's not. I love you, I love our family." "I know you do," I said. "That's not the question. The question is whether that was ever enough for you. Whether I was ever enough." She didn't answer. Not in words. But the silence was its own kind of answer, and we both knew it. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I'm not angry in the way I thought I'd be. I've been angry, quietly, for years without knowing what it was. But right now I'm just clear. For the first time in a very long time, I can see things exactly as they are." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to ask you to stay somewhere else for a few days while I figure out next steps. It means I'm calling a lawyer Monday. It means I need to think about how we tell Eli." She stared at me. "You've already decided." "I decided when I watched you walk into that hotel." A pause. "Actually, I think I decided years ago and kept talking myself out of it." She cried steadily then, not dramatically, the sustained, quiet crying of someone who has known this was coming and is finally allowing themselves to feel its arrival. I handed her a napkin. I sat with her at the table for another hour. We talked, about Eli, about logistics, about who would call who and when. We didn't fight. We were, in some terrible way, more honest with each other in that conversation than we'd been in years. At one point she said, "You always made it so easy for me to not have to choose." I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. She left that night for her parents' house. I washed the dishes. I put away the uneaten dinner. I blew out the candles and sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while, and the refrigerator hummed, and upstairs the baby monitor sat silent on the counter, and I was alone in the house for the first time in 9 years. It was terrible. And underneath the terrible there was something else, something thin and unfamiliar, something I had to sit very still to feel. Space. Just space, where the weight used to be. The divorce took 8 months. It was not hostile. That surprised people, I think. They expected drama, anger, competing lawyers and bitter custody hearings. What they got instead was 2 people who had, through one means or another, arrived at the same exhausted conclusion, that continuing was no longer something either of us could pretend was working. Claire was fair. I was fair. We sold the house on Sycamore Street in April and split the proceeds evenly. We agreed on joint custody, Eli with me during the week, with Claire on weekends and alternating holidays. We told him together, on a Sunday afternoon, in the living room of the house we were about to leave, sitting on either side of him on the couch. He cried. We held him. He asked if it was his fault, and we both told him absolutely not, firmly, without hesitation, and I watched something ease in his small body when he heard it. He asked if we still loved each other. We both said yes, in the past tense way that is also true. We had loved each other, genuinely, in the ways we were capable of. That counted for something. I needed to believe it counted for something. Marcus, as far as I know, did not become what Claire had hoped. Sandra told me, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, that they'd tried and it hadn't worked, that the version of him she'd been maintaining across 15 years of distance and a marriage hadn't survived proximity. I didn't feel satisfaction at that. I'd expected to. What I felt instead was something closer to recognition, that she had been in love with a possibility, a door she'd never fully closed, and that the door, when she finally walked through it, opened onto an ordinary room. Eli adjusted. Kids are harder and more resilient than we expect, both at once. By the following spring he was mostly okay, still sad sometimes, still asking occasionally if Mom and Dad would ever live together again, but rooted. He played soccer. He read books about dinosaurs. He made friends. He laughed, the particular laugh he'd had since babyhood that sounded like something being poured out. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. It was smaller than the house, quieter, mine in a way nothing had been mine for years. I painted Eli's room blue because he asked for blue. I bought a new coffee maker, one I'd chosen myself, and I used it every morning in a kitchen that was only as complicated as I made it. I kept teaching. History, still, World War I in the fall, the Cold War in winter, the Civil Rights Movement in spring. I found I was better at it, somehow. Less distracted. More present in the classroom in a way I hadn't been for years without knowing it. Paul took me to a baseball game in July and bought me a terrible hot dog and said, "You look different," without elaborating. I understood what he meant. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Patience is not a virtue when it becomes a strategy for avoiding the truth. I had spent 9 years calling my silence thoughtfulness, calling my avoidance consideration, calling my fear of confrontation a kind of kindness. I had mistaken endurance for devotion. I had believed, somewhere deep and unexamined, that if I loved her carefully enough and quietly enough and without demands, she would eventually become fully present in our life together. That her restlessness would resolve itself. That the door she'd left open would close on its own. It doesn't work that way. People don't grow toward you simply because you make yourself easy to leave. Claire wasn't a villain. I want to be careful about that, because this story, told differently, could make her one, and she wasn't. She was a person who had never resolved something from her past, who had built a life alongside that unresolved thing rather than working through it, who had chosen comfort and safety with me while keeping alive a connection that gave her something I apparently couldn't. That's a failure of honesty and courage, but it's a human one. I've done my own share of dishonesty in the name of self-protection. Just a different kind. What hurts, when I let myself feel it fully, isn't the betrayal itself. It's the years. The specific, numbered years of Eli's childhood and Sunday dinners and small ordinary moments that were real and good, those happened inside something that was also a lie, and there's no way to separate the two cleanly. You can't keep the good years and return the bad ones. They came together. Eli stayed with me one Wednesday evening in November, almost exactly a year after I'd found the phone in the junk drawer. We were eating dinner, pasta, because pasta was his current favorite food in the same way dinosaurs were his current favorite topic, and he looked up at me with the particular seriousness that arrived on his face sometimes, out of nowhere. "Dad," he said. "Are you happy now?" I looked at him for a moment. The apartment was warm. Rain was hitting the kitchen window. His hair needed cutting. He was 7 years old and he was watching me with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read a room. "Yeah," I said. "I actually am." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his pasta. That was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. There is a particular kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, arranges itself around your daily life, and waits. Daniel's story is largely a story about that pain, the accumulated weight of what he saw and chose not to see, what he knew and chose not to know, what he felt and chose to call something other than what it was. What's worth examining here is not the betrayal itself. Affairs are not uncommon, and the psychology of infidelity has been mapped many times, but the specific mechanism that allowed this one to run uninterrupted for years. Claire's deception was enabled not primarily by her own skill at concealing it, but by Daniel's investment in not finding it. That's a harder truth than the simpler narrative of a faithless wife and a deceived husband. Two people participated in the architecture of this secret, even if only one of them knew it. Daniel's enabling pattern had deep roots. He was a man who had learned, long before Claire, that peace was more valuable than truth, that a difficult silence was preferable to a clarifying confrontation. This isn't unusual. It's one of the most common psychological orientations in long-term relationships, particularly in people who love with high intensity and fear equally high loss. The reasoning, carried inside, sounds like maturity. I won't react from insecurity. I'll give her space. I'll trust rather than accuse. What it actually is, in its less noble form, is the avoidance of any action that might force a result you're not ready to survive. What Daniel couldn't see, until near the end, was that his patience was not neutral. It had a cost, and Claire was the one who named it most precisely in their final conversation. "You always made it so easy for me to not have to choose." This is the understated devastation at the center of the story. His generosity, his endless willingness to find the benign explanation, to not push, to not demand, removed from Claire the pressure that might have forced an honest reckoning years earlier. Unhealthy relationships, like unhealthy ecosystems, thrive when conditions support them. Daniel's accommodation was one of those conditions. There's something important to note about what Claire was carrying too. The relationship with Marcus was never properly ended, it was suspended, held in a kind of emotional escrow, available for reactivation whenever the distance collapsed. This is a specific and recognizable pattern, an attachment that was never grieved, integrated into adult life not as memory but as live current. The version of Marcus she sustained across 15 years was partly real and partly constructed, a repository for everything unresolved, everything she feared had been left behind. The cruelty of the story's aftermath, the news that proximity didn't sustain what distance had preserved, is a quiet but important coda. She hadn't been choosing Marcus over Daniel. She had been choosing a possibility over a reality, and when the possibility became real, it turned out to be ordinary. What Daniel ultimately learned, and what he is still learning, in the apartment on the other side of town, is that love is not demonstrated through what you endure. Loving someone well sometimes requires the willingness to force a crisis that both people are avoiding. The confrontation he'd refused for years was not an act of aggression against the marriage. It was the only act that might have saved it, or ended it honestly before more time passed. Either outcome would have been more respectful of both people than the one they actually lived. The choice he made on that Saturday evening, sitting at a candlelit table with the cold pasta between them, was not a dramatic one. It was simply the first fully honest thing he'd done in years. That's what it looked like when the enabler finally woke up, not a scene, not a speech, not an ultimatum. Just a man who had stopped lying to himself, sitting down to tell the truth. What stays with me, thinking about Daniel's story, is not the betrayal itself, it's the years he spent being genuinely good at the wrong things. Good at absorbing, at explaining, at keeping the surface of his life intact while something beneath it went quietly wrong. We tend to celebrate patience, endurance, the willingness not to rock the boat. And sometimes those qualities are genuinely admirable. But there's a version of them that's something else, a way of loving that asks nothing, accepts everything, and calls the resulting damage by the name of loyalty. If there's anything in this story worth carrying away, it might be this: knowing what you know is not the same as honoring it. The moment you see something clearly and choose instead the comfortable version, you don't protect yourself, you just make the eventual reckoning larger. Daniel didn't lose 9 years because he was betrayed. He lost them because he kept choosing, in small daily ways, the story he wished were true over the one that actually was. The good news is that he found his way back to himself. Slowly, in a 2-bedroom apartment, over pasta with a 7-year-old who wanted to know if he was happy. He was.